12 years ago when Kofi Annan asked me to prepare a report on migration for the UN, the very first person I called was Kathleen. She is famous for both her depth of expertise and her breadth of concern, and everyone in the migration community has been relying upon her for years and years and years. So, Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Michael, you are, as usual, much too kind in your introduction, but let me say what a very great pleasure it is to be here and to kick off this discussion on the role of the private sector in refugee resettlement. As you all know, refugee admissions are very firmly a government prerogative, but there is increasing interest, I think it's fair to say, in many parts of the world in increasing the role of the private sector in the resettlement of refugees. Let me preface that by saying that, of course, the private sector already plays an enormous role in refugee settlement through our humanitarian NGOs, resettlement organizations, through the efforts of civic organizations and communities throughout resettlement countries, and, of course, in the role of private individuals, of church congregations and temples who make a point of making refugees welcome when they resettle in a new community. But there are many avenues for expanding this role, and one that is drawing very great interest is the private sponsorship model, in which Canada has long been the pioneer since 1978, making it possible for individuals coming together in groups or civic organizations to take responsibility for both the financial support and the integration of refugees in Canada. And we are extremely pleased today to have Mr. John McCallum, the Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, who is going to talk about the potential of the Canadian model to be taken up in other countries. Minister McCallum, thank you very much for joining us.
Great pleasure. Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you here at the Concordia Summit, but unfortunately these are 2 crazy days, and I have to leave in about 10 minutes. But nevertheless, it is a pleasure for me to be here. Partly I have to leave because I have to hear my boss give a speech in the United Nations, and it would be bad form if I missed that. But what I want to say is 3 things where I think Canada's experience can help. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is to resettle more refugees. I think not just Australia, US, Canada, the major ones, but try to expand that number. And I think some countries might need advice, which we are happy to provide, because I think one of the things that we have done that I hope is exportable is our privately sponsored refugee model. And just this morning I made an announcement with Filippo Grandi and George Soros. The 3 of us, the UNHCR, Mr. Soros, and the Government of Canada, have launched an initiative to try to export this model to other countries who may be interested. And so far I know of 13 countries who have expressed an interest, and I'm hoping that more will become interested as we proceed. We will provide technical assistance and advice, and we will tell people not only what Canada did right, but also what Canada did wrong. We've made many mistakes along the way, and so I think we know some of the pitfalls. But basically, I would say that you're way, way ahead of the game if you can engage your own citizens to help bring in and sponsor refugees rather than have them come alone or even worse, illegally. And in our country, this has worked very well with the Vietnamese boat people and more recently with the Syrian refugees. So well, in fact, that I'm probably the only immigration minister in the world whose major challenge is that I cannot produce refugees fast enough to satisfy all these private groups who want to take them in. So I think it is a model which I hope will be exportable to other countries. We are certainly keen to try. A second issue where we might offer guidance is we did set up a processing centers in Jordan and Lebanon, where we did manage to process 25,000 refugees in the space of 4 months. And I think we did it well from a health and security point of view, so that model could also potentially be helpful to other countries. And the last point I want to make, because I know speakers aren't supposed to speak too long, is to talk about private sector support. Our project evolved into what one might call a national project, where Canadians of all walks of life became interested, including the private sector, which contributed substantial sums of money. And the message I want to give you is that $1 from the private sector in some ways goes further than $1 from the government. And the reason I say this is that I, as minister, was acutely aware of the point that when executing this refugee program, at no point could we treat refugees better than we treat Canadians. I mean, we had support from Canadians, but that support could dissipate if Canadians got the impression that refugees were privileged. But on the other hand, we needed to support refugees to pay for very high rents in certain parts of the country where rents are high. But we didn't, as a government, want to give rent supplements to refugees where we don't give rent supplements to Canadians receiving social assistance. And that's where the private sector came in. They had a program of rent subsidies. They could do that, we couldn't. So I would encourage anybody from the private sector to think carefully about this. I know Mr. Soros has just committed $500 million today, so that's a good lead. That's an amazing lead, but please bear in mind that often your dollars can go further than an equal number of dollars from the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I wonder if I could just follow up briefly on the question of costs, which you've addressed in terms of the money that the private sector can spend on services and benefits for refugees. But what does private sponsorship cost the government? I mean, there are things that only governments can do, and you've mentioned the hubs that were set up to process people for admission to Canada, the security screening, the health screening, and that. What does the government need to commit to in order to enable and empower the private sector to participate in this way?
Thank you. Well, government, it pays, we have two kinds of refugees, government-assisted refugees and privately sponsored refugees. In all cases, the government pays for the costs of processing, and in the case of government-assisted, the government will pay for 1 year's income level at social assistance levels. Now, in the case of privately sponsored refugees, the government still pays the processing costs, but the individual Canadians have to pay the transport cost and have to pay income support for 1 year. However, the government will provide language training, the government will provide mentoring and assistance to get jobs, but the main difference is that the income support for the 1 year is paid by the private sector rather than by the government. But I might also mention that we have a hybrid model, and this one might be of interest to other countries, where the costs are split 50-50, so that the government will select the refugees from lists provided by UNHCR, and the government will provide 6 months' worth of income, and the private person will provide the other 6 months, but the government will still provide the language and other training.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to Johannes Hahn, who is the European Commissioner for European Neighborhood Policy and Enlargement Negotiations, and ask you how you envision the private sector participating in increased resettlement in EU countries, and whether you see private sponsorship as part of that, or whether you see other models dominating in European countries, and will there be guidance at the EU level on these matters, or will it be left to the individual countries?
First of all, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. I think first I have to stress again, one has to differentiate between refugees and migrants. Europe, as you are certainly aware, is just facing an unprecedented wave of refugees and migrants. I'm saying this because very often these people, for well-known reasons, are throwing away their papers. So it's not clear, are they refugees, are they migrants? They are simply arriving at the shores of the Mediterranean, trying to arrive in Europe. On the Western Mediterranean, we have seen already this year more than 3,000 people being drunken. We could stop more or less the migration or migration wave on the Western Balkan, but this is something with which we have to deal with. If it comes to the refugees, of course, we have to see how we can distribute them in Europe, because some countries are facing, so to say, high number of refugees and others not. Some refuse to take somebody. So this is a very, so to say, different picture, and in some cases, I have to admit, it's not very satisfying. But nevertheless, I would say the financial burden for those member states taking refugees is very high, because we have also a very high level of, how to say, understanding how to deal with refugees. So in Central or Northern Europe, it's totally unacceptable that, for instance, refugees stay in tents, not even in containers. They have to live in apartments. They have to have access to social allowances, etc. There is also a kind of competition amongst some member states. So this is something we have to address. Not related to it, but as an outcome of the economic performance of our member states, we have some countries where we are looking for a skilled labor workforce, and we have others where we have a high unemployment rate, in particular youth unemployment rate. So there are some programs in some member states, for instance, Germany, Netherlands, the country I know best, Austria and others, where companies are working together with public institutions, for instance, in order to offer jobs to people, and public institutions are providing language courses, so that there is a win-win situation, because some of these companies are very often leading global leaders in certain specific niches, and they are looking for people having certain language skills, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to employ those people coming from different parts of the world, providing them with the necessary language skills of their new host country, and use them further on as employees, either in the country itself or on certain export markets. So this is one element where the private sector is very interested inside Europe. I have to admit, we have not yet managed to have a common asylum policy, which I believe is feasible in the medium term at least, but which is totally unrealistic, is to have a common migration policy. As I have said, we have different levels of employment, availability of workforce, etc. It's not realistic to say Europe is looking for this kind of professional skills or that kind. From that perspective, we are far away. This about the internal situation. If it comes to the external, there we have two interests, I have to admit. Both are related to each other. It's about stabilizing the situation and mitigating the pressure on us in terms of a further increase of asylum seekers, migrants, etc. Coming to refugees, our main goal in particular in our proximity is to stabilize the situation by assisting the immediate affected countries, providing money for education, but also for food and health treatment. I think what is extremely important is to provide the necessary financial support to offer education to all children. I have just met the Secretary General of UNHCR, of UNRWA, dealing with the Palestinian refugees. They are always facing a budgetary lack. Because,
Excuse me.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
It's a huge range. I simply wanted to inform you about some elements. So what we're doing is to help host countries in the affected territory to provide education. I think a focus should be, and I had some discussions already here in New York, on vocational training. We are always so far focused on the, so to say, basic education, but what is needed is vocational training, which is in the interest of business sectors. And to conclude, we have just decided to set up a European and external investment fund to provide support to countries of origin of migrants, in particular in Africa. So the overall amount which can be raised is 44 billion euros, and this is only possible if the private sector is coming in, but it should be seen as a kind of seed financing that the private sector is trying to invest in countries of origin in order to give people there already a perspective and not to force them to migrate.
Thank you.
These are the different elements we can
Thank you. I hope
contribute.
we'll have time to come back in the discussion to some points about the extraordinary outpouring we saw from private citizens in Europe as these waves of refugees started coming in 2015 to respond to their needs and so on. But I hope we'll be able to come back to that. First, I'd like to turn to Anne Richard, the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. PRM has a very close and ongoing collaborative relationship with private organizations in the United States to resettle refugees. And I'd like to hear from you, Anne, how you can imagine that kind of collaboration reaching a sort of new level as we begin to accept more refugees.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex Lenikoff, for talking me into coming today on this incredibly busy week. Just what I needed, one more stop. But the good part about this stop is that so many friends and caring people are here. So, of course, I'm thrilled to see all of you. And I also find this a very interesting setup. I'm sort of waiting for Cirque du Soleil to appear and do something, which you might consider for a future Concordia. So you know that last week Secretary Kerry announced our goal of admitting 110,000 refugees to the United States this upcoming fiscal year, which starts October 1st. And as Kathleen says, you know, the scale of what we're trying to do, the scale of the refugee flows around the world, and the scale of what the U.S., our piece of it ought to be, according to some, or could be, or has been in the past, you know, is greater than what we are doing right now. So what we want to do is to increase efforts from all of our current resettlement partners and undertake creative problem solving, and are open to new organizations jumping in as well. As Kathleen alluded to, U.S. refugee resettlement is already heavily supported and implemented in partnership with non-governmental organizations, and we are extremely grateful for this collaboration. Private citizens and civic organizations have helped facilitate the integration and assimilation of more than 3.2 million refugees that the United States has welcomed since 1975. So we're very interested in exploring in fiscal year 2017 ways to amplify the current large role already played by the non-governmental sector and private citizens in refugee resettlement. In reading the New York Times' very good photo display and article from July 1st on what the Canadians are doing to welcome Syrians. What struck me was that some of their model is already being done in the United States. We already use a lot of volunteers. We already work through community organizations. We already see Americans organizing themselves to raise money within their communities. We see Americans, business people, oftentimes small businesses, with real good roots in a community, trying to provide jobs to recently arrived refugees. And we also find that when a business person hires a refugee and then is looking for additional people to hire, they'll come back and say, got any more refugees for me? Because often they're very satisfied with the highly motivated labor pool of the refugees admitted through our program. You know, and a lot of people collect goods and in-kind donations. I heard from a colleague who works in Salt Lake City the other day, they had to stop. This is Salt Lake City, Utah. They had to stop collecting in-kind donations because they don't have any place to put them. They have so many. And that was just such a wonderful thing to hear. So there already is a lot of this going on, and it's not considered, though, private sponsorship, because it's not that final step that is described by my Canadian colleague, by the minister, of really having people raise money for a specific family to sponsor their arrival, their transportation. So we've been learning, and we want to learn a great deal from our Canadian colleagues, and are eager to benefit from the lessons Canada has learned and what it might do differently if starting its program today. And so that's why it's so refreshing that the minister is so comfortable talking about the good and the less good from their experience. We have launched a dialogue with the Refugee Council USA, or RCUSA, on privately sponsored resettlement. We believe the principles that they, you, Melanie, are putting forward to guide additional private resettlement are a good foundation for further exploring this approach. So we will be continuing to work with Refugee Council USA and other organizations interested in private resettlement in the year to come. I would think in the short term, what we would try to do is to launch some kind of pilot to test whether this can be done and try to build some support for the idea. Now, what is our biggest obstacle? I firmly believe that our biggest obstacle is not the mechanics of bringing people here under a private sponsorship program. I think it is the political backlash against refugees. Public opinion polls show that less Americans support resettling refugees than in Canada. In Canada, they have an overwhelming 65%, if I recall correctly, of support from the public for what the Trudeau government is doing. And so I think that gives them a firm foundation for moving forward and really doing more. And that is where I think the election year dynamic is not helping us, and where I'd like to see us all working together come through on the other side of the election by educating more Americans about who refugees are and how they're innocent civilians, victims of wars, families who will make great Americans. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's a really encouraging set of remarks, both recognizing the role that the private sector has played and seeing future prospects that may open this up even further. Becca Heller, you're director and co-founder of IRAP, and have done a lot of thinking along with colleagues from Human Rights First, from the Urban Justice Center, and from Migration Policy Institute about how private sponsorship might work in the United States. Could you give us just a very brief set of points about how you see that possibility?
Sure, and I just want to mention that all of our organizations have been working closely with RCUSA also, and that IRAP and Human Rights First are members So I think a lot of the principles will be pretty similar. We're coming out with a comprehensive proposal to say, okay, there is interest in a pilot, there is willingness from the Canadians to do training, let's see some action. And the paper, which you have an executive summary of, describes what that action might actually look like. Without getting deep into the mechanics, which are not that interesting, I would say that we think there's a couple key principles. One is the principle of additionality, that any private sponsorship program to bring refugees to the U.S. has to be in addition to the number that the U.S. is funding through government programs. You could calculate that as a percentage or simply as a sum, but the idea would be to make sure that private funds weren't an excuse for Congress to then cut funding for refugee resettlement. I think another principle that we've looked at is that it should be a partnership between resettlement agencies and local agencies and private individuals. The state of Connecticut has actually done this very successfully. A single local resettlement agency there has been partnering with businesses and religious organizations and individuals, and they've provided training for them in how to resettle refugees, so you can use the expertise of the resettlement agencies to provide support to the individuals that are doing the resettlement, and through that they've doubled in 1 year the number of refugees who are going to Connecticut. So our paper is going to look at that as a possible model. Finally, I just want to respond to Secretary Richards' point and say that I think that rather than the current political climate being an obstacle to private sponsorship, I would suggest that private sponsorship is a pretty incredible answer to some of the challenges posed by the current political climate. I think there are two main reasons for that. The first, on sort of a broad policy level, is that Senator Sessions and Representative Goodlatte leaked the presidential determination this year and then immediately put out a press release, oh my God, 110,000 refugees, what will become of us? I think that there's a tendency for refugee admissions in the U.S. to be held hostage to the congressional appropriations process. So if there were a way to supplement that, it would be sending a message to those in Congress who would sort of use the power of the purse to prevent the U.S. from fulfilling its humanitarian obligations, that we will not be held hostage to you. We will admit refugees regardless of this. And the second is on a much more grassroots level. I think that it's easy to dislike someone who you don't know. And this concept of refugees as the other, the fact that so much of the awareness came from the photo of one 3-year-old boy. I think that obviously the individual stories of refugees and individual familiarity is going to play a critical role in changing public opinion in the US as well as other countries. I think you saw this huge swell of support in Europe because people couldn't avoid refugees in their communities. So I think that using a private sponsorship model in the US as a way to create direct links between individuals and businesses and organizations and refugees will actually go a long way toward turning the tide of public opinion and creating more of a groundswell of support for refugees. And while I recognize that there's some informal partnering and ad hoc private partnering happening now, I would urge the U.S. government to step forward and make it official.
Thanks, Becca. I'd like to turn now to Melanie Nazer, who is a vice president of HIAS, one of the major resettlement organizations in the United States. And Melanie also currently holds the chair of the Refugee Council USA, which is a consortium of resettlement agencies and other organizations that support refugees within the United States. And as Anne mentioned, RCUSA has been very active in recent months and really considering the possibilities of private sponsorship, but more than that is one of the real engines of private sector engagement in many ways with refugee resettlement. So Melanie, we look forward to hearing from you about how RCUSA works with a whole array of private organizations in the U.S.
Sure. Thanks, Kathleen. And thank you also just for all your years of guidance and expertise on all of these issues. And thank you to Anne and the administration. We, as RCUSA, are always calling for more refugees, more assistance, but in this political climate, which I think is quite challenging, the fact that this administration has increased admissions for the last 2 years, and this year is on track to actually meet that goal. Despite all the challenges, I think is a huge accomplishment. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask a question because I don't know if we're all on the same page. Can you raise your hand if you know how the Refugee Resettlement Program works in the U.S.? You know? So maybe it's worth a quick review. Right now, it's the State Department actually identifies the refugees, usually through referrals from the UN Refugee Agency, of who actually comes to the country. So that's a government function. The Department of Homeland Security will interview every single refugee that comes to this country abroad. They actually go to all these places and interview every single one to ensure that the person is admissible, that the person is a refugee, and that they pass all security and medical screenings. And I'm sure a lot of you have been following the news with all these allegations that this is a program without, sufficient security. There is a huge amount of security screening that goes on. Refugees are the most vetted individuals that come to this country. So that gets done. And then the State Department will partner with the 9 voluntary agencies, they're called. These are nonprofit organizations, most of which are faith-based. So we are the Jewish Refugee Agency, but the U.S. Catholic Church is actually the largest resettlement organization in the U.S. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, IRC. There are a number of organizations that do this, World Relief, which is the evangelical church. So we partner with the State Department to decide where we can resettle refugees. We have 350 affiliates collectively across the country and local communities in every state except for, I think, Wyoming, maybe? Where we actually receive the refugees in local communities with our affiliate partnerships, many of which are associated with churches and synagogues, but also, non-sectarian organizations. And that is where we really engage the private sector. And that's where I think in all this discussion about private resettlement, which is really important for the reasons that Becca outlined, it's that we do have a mechanism, a hybrid mechanism, where we really are able to bring in the resources and enthusiasm of the private sector, of volunteers, of local businesses that have been our strongest advocates for refugee resettlement. Now, are those voices loud enough? No. Do we need a lot more support for a public awareness campaign about the benefits of refugees? Yes. Do we need new models so that eventually, as years go on, as this refugee crisis does not diminish, we are able to do more, which we clearly think that the U.S. should be doing? Yes, we need all of that. But in the meantime, there's so much that we can be doing to engage the private sector even more, and we want to make sure that people know that there are ways today, while we develop new methods, for people to engage. So just really quickly, and this can happen right now, you could partner with one of the 350 local resettlement agencies to resettle refugee families. I mean, that happens all the time, but this is something that maybe people aren't aware that can be done. Individual and groups can bolster capacity for resettlement by donating directly to one of the refugee resettlement agencies or other community-based organizations that help refugees. Depending on the community that you're interested in, 10,000 Syrian refugees have come in, but there is no Muslim resettlement agency at this point. So if there are local organizations that are out there that are helping Syrian refugees on the local level, you can partner with mosques or other organizations. That would be great. Employing refugees is good business. As Anne outlined, many employers are happy to employ refugees, provide vocational training, participate in job fairs, supplies, ESL. There are lots of things that the private sector does, but we need more of, especially as the numbers increase. Also really important, and also something we've been trying to find the resources for a long time, recertification and recredentialing of professionals that come here. We have a lot of experienced doctors and other professionals that could be of great service to this country. But they don't have the credentials. So that's costly. We do that on a one-off basis, but more investment in that would be great. We also have something called the Matching Grant Program, which is an alternative to public cash assistance for newly arrived refugees that basically provides services for them to become economically self-sufficient within their first 6 months in the U.S. That could be also augmented by private dollars. So I do want to just, in terms of the private, we have been in long discussions about how to set up a private sponsorship pilot program because we think that, again, new methods are going to be needed to expand this program. The concept of additionality is really important. We don't want this to be an excuse for Congress that's already inclined to cut funding, to cut more funding. So that's important. We need to make sure that this program coordinates with the national resettlement agencies. We have a lot of monitoring. Yeah, we have a lot of monitoring. We have a lot of reporting. We have a lot of training that goes on with our resettlement. We have a very professional network. We don't want to lose that as we bring in the private individuals. I mean, we need to make sure that people are trained and held accountable for the quality of resettlement. Also to make sure that that maintains the principles of non-discrimination and needs-based access to the program. We don't want to have certain populations of refugees that have more benefits, better benefits, more access than others. That's a very balanced decision that the State Department makes, and we don't want the private sector to kind of create that imbalance. So those are just some of the things, and I do want to say before wrapping up, in the talk of all the private sector investment in refugees, I want to point out that Interaction, which is the coalition of humanitarian organizations, just recently announced that 30 of its members, including HIAS and others, LARS, will be pledging $1.2 billion in the next 3 years to refugees and migrants. So we also mobilize a lot of private resources, and I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for giving us that overview of the U.S. program. And as you probably know, the U.S. resettles more refugees than any other country in the world, and in most years more than all other countries put together. I just want to make 2 points, and I did not make opening remarks because I knew that Minister McCallum had to leave, but let me just make a couple of points, which is that first of all, there are currently 5 countries in which private sponsorship programs operate. They are New Zealand, Canada, of course, also New Zealand, Australia, although Australia's program is not additive. Privately sponsored refugees are subtracted from their overall ceiling. New Zealand, Argentina, very small program, and 15 of the 16 German Länder have private sponsorship programs. Ireland and Switzerland have experimented with private sponsorship on a family basis, but time limited, and they're no longer in operation. So there is, the Canadian experience dwarfs all others, and there is a great deal to learn from that. Most of the private sector contributions we've been talking about have sort of been micro level, at the community level where refugees are resettling individuals, congregations, businesses, community groups participating at that level. But I also want to point out that I think that there is an important role at the macro level as well for private companies and for philanthropy, particularly in the United States. One of the big questions about costs has to do with health insurance for refugees. And that, for a private sponsor to take that on, is really a huge expense in the United States. And that, it seems to me, is one area where private insurance companies or indeed philanthropies could help subsidize the efforts of private individuals. Also, some form of insurance to step in if a sponsoring family has a financial crisis, if somehow the relationship breaks down. I think providing a sort of safety net under private sponsorship is something that both companies and philanthropies can contribute greatly to. This is an area and a subject for experimentation. I think the pilot project approach is exactly the right way to start. And I don't know if you was there any discussion of this at all in the run-up to the President's summit, or do you expect, or in the private sector meetings?
What we have been talking about private sponsorship was to try to help reach the 110,000 next year, but that hasn't been the central discussion at the White House. And so I am not willing, even though there is only a few months left in the Obama administration, I would really like to see if we can lay the groundwork to get something off the ground before leaving office. Today, there is the President's Leaders Summit. There's also a call to action, a private sector call to action with some big corporations coming in to say that they will do more for refugees. So that's potentially big money. And I should have mentioned it before, but I was also trying to make the point about how smaller and medium-sized firms can do a lot. One example you may have heard before that sort of bridges from the very big to the small is Hamdi Ulukayu, the founder of Chobani, makes a point of not just funding the 10 Foundation now, but also hiring refugees. And since becoming a successful multimillionaire or billionaire, I don't know how much money he has, but he's got more than he needs. He has been hanging out with Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and other corporate titans and going to Davos. And so he's trying to get, really let this catch fire that other CEOs should emulate him, and I hope that does indeed happen, because I think it's a great story, and he speaks about it with real passion.
Wonderful, thank you. To hear a little bit more about the Canadian experience, I'd like to ask Jennifer Bond to make some remarks. She's a professor of law at the University of Ottawa and founder and managing director of their Refugee Hub. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to add my voice to this table. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll speak very briefly. I know that we have some time constraints, and there's interesting threads to the conversation that others might like to jump in on. I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's been involved in the Canadian program, both at the policy level and at the grassroots level, but more directly today as someone who's involved in the joint initiative that was announced and that Minister McCallum referred to, that aims to share Canada's experiences and capacities and encourage adaptation of private sponsorship in other jurisdictions. I just wanted to take one brief moment to put a few challenges on the table for actors from other jurisdictions who may be looking at private sponsorship. The first is to think carefully about the scope of the term private sector, and I think there is a tendency to reduce that term to civil society actors, maybe even further reduce it to faith-based groups, or to think about big corporate actors. And I think that one of the recent experiences in Canada is that they're expanding that term offers a very powerful potential to engage all kinds of unusual sectors. So our post-secondary institutions are engaged. We have different sized businesses involved. We have municipalities who are themselves privately sponsoring, and so on. So think carefully if you're looking at this space. It can go well beyond the traditional large donor or small faith-based group. The second point I'd like to make is that what these actors can do can also vary. And so again, there's a tendency, I think, to point out the financial benefits. There certainly are those. I would add to hard cash that it's helpful when you're setting up private sponsorship to consider the infrastructure, the actual mechanics of the infrastructure, and the fact that private sponsorship takes some of that out of government and puts it into communities, which can be very beneficial, quite aside from the financial side. But they're also able to really provide a type of support that is unique. And this is something that some states, including the U.S., have already worked on, and they have some established resettlement streams which would complement private sponsorship quite nicely. Other states haven't done as much building of that local infrastructure, and I think that there really is an opportunity to use private sponsorship not only for the immediate refugee resettlement goal, but also to build infrastructure, which will help with your state-based sponsorships and also generally grow capacity in the sector. Many other roles, but I just want to encourage you to don't stop your thinking at dollars and cents. And the third point, and it's already been mentioned by a few of the speakers, but I really want to underscore it, this is not only a project or an opportunity to think about bringing in more persons. It's not entirely about numbers and increasing resettlement spaces, though there certainly is that opportunity. And I think the global project hopes very much that there may be increased overall resettlement capacity through growth of private sponsorship streams. But it's also a very powerful tool to impact that bigger narrative. And I think that Becca made some key points here, but certainly the Canadian experience has been that by having a decentralized system, by having refugees that are very much brought in by local persons, supporting by local persons in our communities all across the country, that has facilitated government action. And I recognize a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but I think that when speaking about Canada's recent initiative, very important to note that at a time when our government was not taking a leadership position on this file, Canadians were mobilized by the tens of thousands because they had a vehicle. So providing that vehicle is critical. That then provides a way for this expression of support, which in turn can facilitate bolder political engagement. So I would encourage you to think about that in its multiplicity and sort of nuanced way. Again, I want to say that I'm delighted to see the support of OSF, UNHCR, and Canada to think about this engagement. If there are other states either who are quite seriously considering private sponsorship or who aren't and are really just having some questions, the goal of the initiative is to try to provide more information at one end of the spectrum and also provide much more support in whatever form makes the most sense. So we look forward to working hopefully with many of you in coming weeks and months. And again, I'm delighted to be here and add my voice to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and for pointing out, I think especially that it's not just about the numbers. In addition about the broader public engagement, I think it's also about quality of resettlement. And there have been some study of this in Canada that shows that refugees who are actually privately sponsored rather than government sponsored have better outcomes over time, at least in the first sort of 5 years after resettlement. So it's numbers, it's quality, and it's part of building public support for refugee programs. I am very sorry to say that we are running out of time. If we have maybe one or two comments, very, very briefly, if I'm sorry to put that constraint on you, but could we start here and there and just 1 point?
Sorry, very briefly. My name's Julia Onslow-Cole. I'm Head of Global Immigration for PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you very much, Michael and Kathleen, for chairing these very interesting sessions. PwC were very privileged to work with UNHCR and OECD on a series of roundtables we've been holding with employers across Europe on employing refugees. And we've had these sessions in Brussels and Copenhagen. And it was a really excellent way to get employers together who are actually having really meaningful schemes and employing a lot of refugees. And the thing that we discovered, and there will be a full report, but one of the things that I think, and it was really came out of all these meetings, is that business are really keen to engage, but often they just don't know how to. And I just wonder if we could give them a little bit more support, like, for example, setting up and identifying skills available and putting that to business and helping with language training, that then it would get more schemes off the ground. So I think if a bit more support could be given to business, I think they're really receptive, but often they just don't know what to do.
Thank you for that, for bringing to our attention the PricewaterhouseCoopers activities, but also making that extremely important point about having the importance of having a vehicle, which Jennifer also raised. And final comment.
Thanks, Sasha Chanoff with Refuge Point. Thank you to Concordia. I wanted to make a few brief points, a couple about the need to provide information here in the U.S. One, that I think it's essential to promote understanding about the rigorous process that Melanie talked about in terms of the vetting. Sometimes it takes up to 2 years for a refugee to arrive here. We can do better than that, but the public needs to know that. Secondly, that refugees contribute to our economy. If you look at Lewiston, Maine, Utica, New York, St. Louis, Missouri, you see examples of Somalis, Bosnians, and others who've regenerated depressed areas of cities. These are really important messages. And lastly, we have to recognize that while about a quarter of the refugees globally right now are from Syria, 3/4 are not. And when we think about resettlement, we have to ensure that those, no matter where they are or where they're from need to have access to it as a life-saving solution. And UNHCR is making great strides in collaboration with Refuge Point, International Refugee Assistance Project, and many other organizations to ensure that refugees are being reached no matter where they are.
Thank you very much. That's good, a good note on which to end. And I want to thank all our panelists, and including those who had to leave. Thank you.